The night was quiet, almost unnervingly so, as the soft rustle of leaves outside swayed under the moonlight. Sarah, a single mother for almost a decade, felt the rarest sense of calm as she pulled the blanket tighter around her. Exhausted from the week's chaos of balancing work and home, she thought tonight would be one of those peaceful evenings where nothing extraordinary happened. But life has a way of throwing surprises when you least expect them. Her son, Daniel, was her world. At almost 20, he was more than just her child. He was her confidant, her greatest source of pride, and sometimes her silent reminder of all they had endured. After her divorce, they had built a life together. A life that wasn't perfect but was filled with love and understanding. Sarah often found herself amazed at how thoughtful Daniel could be, how he carried a sense of responsibility beyond his years. Tonight, though, she had seen him retreat into his room after dinner, his usual smile a little dimmer. She wanted to ask if everything was okay, but she let it slide, assuming he'd talk when he was ready. The house had grown still, the only sound being the distant ticking of the hallway clock. Sarah's eyelids felt heavy as she drifted into the softness of sleep, but then came a sound she hadn't expected. A soft knock on her door. "Mom!" Daniel's voice broke through the haze of her light slumber, a quiet but unmistakable call. It was rare for him to wake her at this hour, and her heart skipped slightly as she sat up, trying to shake off her drowsiness. She could see his silhouette in the dim glow from the hallway as he stepped inside, hesitating before closing the door softly behind him. "Daniel, what's wrong?" Her voice was laced with concern, though she tried to keep it calm. He hesitated for a moment, shifting on his feet, his eyes downcast. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted quietly, his tone carrying something deeper, something unsaid. Sarah's worry grew as she patted the space next to her on the bed. "Come here," she urged softly. "Sit with me for a bit." Daniel moved closer, sitting hesitantly before lying down beside her. She noticed how tired he looked, his usually confident demeanor replaced by a vulnerable silence. It reminded her of when he was younger, seeking comfort from her during sleepless nights. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked gently. He shook his head but stayed close, the weight of something unsaid lingering in the air between them. As she brushed his hair out of his eyes, a small smile crossed his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. They lay there quietly, the calm of the moment contrasting with the tension Sarah could feel bubbling just beneath the surface. Then, in the quietest voice, Daniel asked, "Mom, do you ever miss him?" The question struck her, a whisper of the past she had long tried to bury. She knew exactly who he meant, and as her heart ached for the pain he must have been holding on to, she realized this night would bring more than just restless sleep. Something deeper was about to surface, and she wasn't sure either of them was ready for it. The night was quiet, almost unnervingly so, as the soft rustle of leaves outside swayed under the moonlight. Sarah, a single mother for almost a decade, felt the rarest sense of calm as she pulled the blanket tighter around her. Exhausted from the week's chaos of balancing work and home, she thought tonight would be one of those peaceful evenings where nothing extraordinary happened. But life has a way of throwing surprises when you least expect them. Her son, Daniel, was her world. At almost 20, he was more than just her child. He was her confidant, her greatest source of pride, and sometimes her silent reminder of all they had endured. After her divorce, they had built a life together, a life that wasn't perfect but was filled with love and understanding. Sarah often found herself amazed at how thoughtful Daniel could be, how he carried a sense of responsibility beyond his years. Tonight, though, she had seen him retreat into his room after dinner, his usual smile a little dimmer. She wanted to ask if everything was okay, but she let it slide, assuming he'd talk when he was ready. The house had grown still, the only sound being the distant ticking of the hallway clock. Sarah's eyelids felt heavy as she drifted into the softness of sleep, but then came a sound she hadn't expected. A soft knock on her door. "Mom!" Daniel's voice broke through the haze of her light slumber, a quiet but unmistakable call. It was rare for him to wake her at this hour, and her heart skipped slightly as she sat up, trying to shake off her drowsiness. She could see his silhouette in the dim glow from the hallway as he stepped inside, hesitating before closing the door softly behind him. "Daniel, what's wrong?" Her voice was laced with concern, though she tried to keep it calm. He hesitated for a moment, shifting on his feet, his eyes downcast. I couldn't sleep, he admitted quietly, his tone carrying something deeper, something unsaid. Sarah's worry grew as she patted the space next to her on the bed. Come here, she urged softly. Sit with me for a bit. Daniel moved closer, sitting hesitantly before lying down beside her. She noticed how tired he looked, his usually confident demeanor replaced by a vulnerable silence. It reminded her of when he was younger, seeking comfort from her during sleepless nights. Do you want to talk about it? She asked gently. He shook his head but stayed close, the weight of something unsaid lingering in the air between them. As she brushed his hair out of his eyes, a small smile crossed his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. They lay there quietly, the calm of the moment contrasting with the tension Sarah could feel bubbling just beneath the surface. Then, in the quietest voice, Daniel asked, Mom, do you ever miss him? The question struck her, a whisper of the past she had long tried to bury. She knew exactly who he meant, and as her heart ached for the pain he must have been holding on to, she realized this night would bring more than just restless sleep. Something deeper was about to surface, and she wasn't sure either of them was ready for it. Sarah's thoughts raced as she searched for the right words, her mind flashing back to memories she had kept locked away for years. Sometimes, Daniel, she said finally, her voice soft, but not in the way you might think. She paused, watching his expression carefully. It's more about what could have been than what actually was. Daniel shifted beside her, his brow furrowing as he stared at the ceiling. I just keep wondering, he murmured. If we could have done something different. If maybe he'd have stayed. His voice cracked slightly, and Sarah felt her chest tighten. Daniel, she said, sitting up a little, you were just a kid. None of this was your fault, or mine. People make choices, and sometimes those choices hurt others, even when they don't mean to. She reached out, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. Your dad made his decision, but that doesn't mean he didn't love you. It doesn't feel that way, Daniel whispered, his voice heavy with emotion. He's been gone so long, Mom. Sometimes, it's like he was never really here. Sarah's heart ached for her son, for the pain he had carried in silence. She pulled him into a gentle hug, feeling his body tense before he relaxed against her. I know it's hard, sweetheart, she said softly, but you don't have to carry this alone. You're not alone. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the faint sound of wind outside. Daniel pulled back slightly, his eyes glistening as he met hers. Thanks, Mom, he said quietly, for always being there. Sarah smiled, though her mind remained restless. Something about the way Daniel had spoken, the weight of his words, left her with a sense of unease. She knew tonight wasn't just about old wounds. There was something more, something he wasn't saying yet. And as much as she wanted to protect him, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a deeper, more complicated conversation they both needed to have. The night seemed heavier now, the stillness in the air carrying an unspoken weight between Sarah and Daniel. She could feel it, the tension that lingered after their exchange, as if the room itself held its breath. Daniel had always been sensitive, but tonight his vulnerability was raw, unguarded in a way that made her heart ache. She wanted to say more to reassure him, but she wasn't sure if words would be enough to bridge the gap between them. Daniel shifted beside her, pulling the blanket up to his chest as he stared at the ceiling. His silence was unnerving, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was bubbling beneath the surface. She studied his profile in the dim light, the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes seemed far away. It was as though he was fighting a battle within himself, one he wasn't ready to share. You know you can tell me anything, she said softly, her voice breaking the quiet like a ripple across still water. Whatever it is, Daniel, we'll face it together. He hesitated, his lips parting slightly before closing again. Finally, he sighed, a sound heavy with frustration and resignation. It's not that easy, Mom, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes I feel like I'm supposed to have it all figured out by now. Like I'm supposed to be stronger or better. But I don't know if I can be. Sarah's heart sank at his words, the pain in them cutting through her. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. You don't have to have it all figured out, she said, her tone firm but kind. No one does. Life isn't about being perfect, Daniel. It's about doing your best, one step at a time. And you're already so much stronger than you think. He nodded but didn't meet her gaze. Instead, He turned slightly, pulling his knees up as if to shield himself from the world. "Sometimes I wonder if Dad ever felt this way," he murmured. "Like he wasn't good enough. Like he couldn't handle it." The mention of his father struck a chord deep within Sarah. She thought about it too, on those nights when loneliness crept in like an unwelcome visitor. But she couldn't let Daniel see her doubts. "Not now. I think your dad had his own struggles," she said carefully. "But those struggles were his to face. They don't define you, Daniel. You're your own person, and you've made it through so much already." For a moment, it seemed like her words had reached him. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers for something. Reassurance, perhaps, or understanding. But then his gaze shifted away, and he sat up abruptly, running a hand through his hair. "I just need some air," he muttered, already heading for the door. "Daniel," Sarah called after him, but he didn't stop. The door closed softly behind him, leaving her alone in the dim light. She sat there for a long moment, her mind racing with worry. What was he holding back? And why did it feel like the more she tried to reach him, the further he slipped away? Outside, the night was cool and still. The stars scattered like pinpricks of light across the inky sky. Daniel stood on the porch, his hands gripping the railing as he stared out into the darkness. His thoughts were a whirlwind, each one more chaotic than the last. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was failing. Failing himself, failing his mom, failing everyone who believed in him. He'd carried this weight for so long, pretending to be okay, pretending to be the strong one. But tonight, it felt unbearable, like a dam about to burst. And the worst part was he didn't know how to explain it. Didn't know how to tell his mom that sometimes the expectations felt like chains, tightening around him until he couldn't breathe. The sound of the door creaking open behind him startled him, and he turned to see Sarah stepping out, a blanket draped over her shoulders. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him, her presence a quiet reassurance. "It's a beautiful night," she said finally, her voice soft. "But I'd rather be in the cold with you than inside alone." Daniel's grip on the railing loosened slightly, and for the first time that night, he let out a small, shaky laugh. "You're stubborn, you know that," he said, glancing at her. "I've been told," she replied with a smile. "But it runs in the family, doesn't it?" For a moment, the heaviness between them lifted, and the silence felt less oppressive. But Sarah knew this wasn't over. There were still shadows lingering in Daniel's eyes, and whatever he was holding on to, it was only a matter of time before it came to light. The air outside was crisp, carrying a faint scent of damp earth and leaves. Sarah wrapped the blanket tightly around her as she stood beside Daniel, trying to read his expression in the dim moonlight. His jaw was clenched, and his hands gripped the railing as if letting go would send him spiraling into the darkness beyond. She wanted to reach out, to pull him back into the warmth of their home and their bond. But something held her back. She knew he needed this moment, even if it tore her apart to see him like this. "You don't have to keep it all inside," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of both love and worry. "Whatever it is, Daniel, I'm here. I've always been here." He exhaled sharply, his breath visible in the cool night air. "That's just it, Mom," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "You're always here, holding everything together. And I feel like I'm falling apart." Sarah's heart ached at his words, but she stayed silent, giving him the space to speak. He looked down, his knuckles white against the wood of the railing. "I don't know who I'm supposed to be anymore," he continued, his voice breaking. "I keep trying to be strong for you, for us, but sometimes it feels like I'm failing. Like I'll never be enough." She stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Daniel, you are enough," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "You've always been enough, and you don't have to carry this weight alone. It's okay to lean on me, just like I've leaned on you." His shoulders trembled, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might let the wall he'd built around himself crumble. But instead, he pulled away, stepping back from the railing and running a hand through his hair. "I wish it were that simple," he muttered, pacing along the porch. "But it's not. There's so much I can't say, so much I don't even know how to say." The words hung between them, heavy and unresolved. Sarah watched him, her mind racing with questions she was too afraid to voice. What was he holding back? What could be so painful, so overwhelming, that he couldn't share it with her? She felt the distance between them like a chasm, widening with every step he took. "You don't have to figure it out alone," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together. That's what family does." Daniel stopped pacing, his back to her as he stood at the edge of the porch. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Finally, he turned to face her, his expression a mix of fear and resolve. "What if it's something you can't fix, Mom?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if it's something that changes everything?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The raw vulnerability in his eyes was unlike anything she'd ever seen. She took a step toward him, her heart pounding as 1,000 possibilities raced through her mind. "Daniel, whatever it is, we'll face it together," she said again, her voice steadier this time. "I promise you, nothing could ever make me stop loving you." His gaze softened, but the tension in his posture didn't ease. He looked away, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I need some time," he said finally, his voice almost too quiet to hear. "To figure out how to tell you." Sarah nodded, her chest tight with worry. "Take the time you need," she said gently. "But just know I'm here. Always." Daniel gave her a small nod before stepping off the porch and disappearing into the shadows of the yard. Sarah stood there for a long time, the cold seeping through the blanket around her shoulders. Her mind swirled with unanswered questions, the unease in her chest growing stronger. Whatever he was struggling with, she knew it was something big, and as much as she wanted to protect him, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was a storm they were both about to face together. Sarah couldn't sleep that night. The chill of the air seeped through the house, but it wasn't the cold that kept her awake, it was Daniel. His words, his anguish, and the look in his eyes haunted her. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence around her amplifying the questions swirling in her mind. What could he be hiding? And why was he so afraid to tell her? She wanted to trust that he'd come to her when he was ready, but the mother in her ached to protect him, to fix whatever was breaking him inside. Hours passed, and just as she felt herself drifting off, a sound jolted her awake. The soft creak of the floorboards in the hallway. Her heart skipped, and she sat up, straining to hear. The sound grew louder until there was a knock at her door, gentle, hesitant. "Mom!" Daniel's voice was shaky, almost a whisper. Sarah's chest tightened as she quickly swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood. She opened the door to find him standing there, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. "Daniel, what is it?" she asked, her voice a mix of concern and urgency. He looked at her for a long moment, as though searching for the courage to speak. Then, with a deep breath, he said, "I need to tell you something, but I don't know how." Sarah stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. They sat on the edge of the bed, the room dimly lit by the soft glow of the moon through the curtains. She placed a hand on his, grounding him. "Whatever it is, Daniel, just say it. We'll figure it out together." His eyes glistened as he nodded, swallowing hard. "It's about Dad," he began, his voice unsteady. I found something. A few months ago." He paused, running a hand through his hair as if trying to steady his thoughts. "I didn't want to believe it at first, but—" "Daniel, what did you find?" Sarah pressed gently, her heart pounding. He pulled his phone from his pocket and handed it to her. On the screen was a photo, blurred but unmistakable. It was of a man, her ex-husband. But it wasn't the man she remembered. He was standing with another family, smiling, his arm draped protectively around a young boy. The boy looked just like Daniel had at that age. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. "Daniel, where did you get this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I found it online," he admitted. "I didn't know how to tell you, Mom. I didn't want to hurt you, but I had to know the truth. So I messaged him." Sarah's eyes widened. You spoke to him?" Daniel nodded, his expression conflicted. "I asked him why he left, why he started a new family and never looked back. He said he didn't think he could be the father we needed, that it was easier to start over." His voice broke, and tears streamed down his face. "Mom, I don't understand. How could he do that to us? To you?" Sarah felt her chest tighten, a mix of anger, pain, and protectiveness surging within her. She pulled Daniel into a hug, holding him tightly as he cried. "It's not your fault, Daniel. None of this is your fault. He made his choices, and they have nothing to do with you or your worth. As they sat there, a thought struck her, a realization that sent a chill down her spine. The boy in the photo, his resemblance to Daniel wasn't just uncanny. It was too similar. Sarah's stomach turned as a possibility she hadn't considered took root in her mind. Daniel, she said carefully, pulling back to look at him. Did he say anything else? About the boy in the picture? Daniel shook his head, wiping his face. No, just that he wanted a fresh start. Sarah's mind raced, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed clicking into place. She didn't want to believe it, but deep down, she couldn't ignore the gnawing suspicion. Could the boy be more than just his son? Could he be Daniel's brother? She didn't say it aloud, not yet. But as she held Daniel close, her resolve hardened. Whatever the truth was, she would find it. And this time, she wouldn't let her ex-husband's choices dictate their lives. This was their story now, and she was determined to face whatever came next, side by side with her son. The next morning came slowly, sunlight seeping through the curtains and spilling over the room. Sarah had barely slept, her thoughts tangled in the revelation Daniel had shared and the implications of the photo. She made her way downstairs, finding Daniel already sitting at the kitchen table, staring into a mug of untouched coffee. His shoulders were slumped, and the exhaustion on his face mirrored her own. "Morning," she said softly, her voice breaking the fragile silence. He looked up, managing a weak smile, but the weight of their conversation still lingered between them. Sarah sat across from him, reaching out to place a comforting hand on his. "I've been thinking," she began, searching for the right words, "about what you told me, about the picture.
And
I think we need to know the truth. Whatever it is, we deserve that much." Daniel hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. "What if it's worse than we think, Mom? What if—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Then we face it together," Sarah said firmly, squeezing his hand. "No matter what. But we can't let this hang over us. It's time to stop living in the shadow of his choices." After breakfast, they decided to call him. Sarah's hands trembled as she dialed the number Daniel had saved. The phone rang, each tone echoing in her chest like a drumbeat, until finally, a familiar voice answered. "Hello." The sound of her ex-husband's voice was jarring, stirring a mix of emotions she'd long buried. "It's Sarah," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We need to talk." The conversation that followed was tense and halting, filled with pauses and carefully chosen words. Her ex admitted to starting a new family, but insisted it had nothing to do with Daniel or her. "I was a coward," he confessed. "I thought leaving would make things easier for everyone, but I see now how much I hurt you both. I'm sorry." When Sarah pressed about the boy in the photo, there was another pause, longer this time. "He's my son," he admitted finally. "Daniel's brother." The truth landed like a weight, heavy and inevitable. Daniel sat frozen, his face unreadable, as Sarah processed the words. She felt a rush of emotions, anger, sadness, relief, all mingling in a storm she could barely contain. "Why didn't you tell us?" she demanded. Daniel deserved to know he had a brother. "I thought it would be easier this way," he said quietly. "I didn't want to make things harder for him. But I see now I was wrong." The call ended with promises of trying to rebuild, of finding a way to connect the fractured pieces of their family. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. Later that day, Sarah and Daniel sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was cool, but the warmth of their bond was undeniable. "How do you feel?" she asked gently, glancing at him. He was quiet for a moment before replying. "I don't know."
angry.
Sad, but also kind of hopeful. "Maybe it's not too late to figure this out." Sarah smiled, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "It's never too late, Daniel. As long as we're honest with each other, we'll be okay." As they sat there, the weight of the past began to lift, replaced by the promise of new beginnings. They didn't have all the answers, but they had each other. And for now, that was enough.